The year was 2347, and humanity had changed in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. They had spread across 17 star systems, building cities on alien worlds and making friends with species that breathed different air and saw different colors. Commander Jake Lawson stood on the bridge of his starship, the Meridian, watching the stars drift past the observation window. He was 42 years old, with gray starting to show at his temples and laugh lines around his eyes. He had spent 20 years in the Terran Federation Navy, and most of those years had been peaceful ones. The galaxy, it turned out, was not as dangerous as the old science fiction movies had predicted. Oh, there were conflicts here and there, border disputes and trade disagreements, but nothing like the wars humanity had fought against itself in centuries past. The 3 alien species they had encountered in the Orion sector were reasonable enough. The Veth were tall and thin, with skin like polished wood and a fondness for philosophy. The Sundari were short and stocky, covered in fine scales, and they loved nothing more than a good bargain. The Kreth were strange, insectoid beings who communicated through a combination of clicks and pheromones, but they were honest traders and kept their word. Humanity had earned a reputation in galactic circles. They were seen as young and energetic, full of curiosity and optimism. They built things. They explored. They asked endless questions about everything they encountered. The older species found them amusing, like enthusiastic puppies that had just discovered a vast new yard to play in. Some of them even found humans endearing. Jake thought about this as he guided his ship toward the frontier world of New Haven. They were escorting a transport full of colonists, families looking to start fresh on a world with clean air and open spaces. He had done this run a dozen times before. It was routine work, the kind of mission where the biggest challenge was keeping his crew from getting bored. Lieutenant Amy Grant sat at the communications station, her red hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail. She was young, barely 25, and still excited about every new thing she encountered in space. Jake liked her enthusiasm. It reminded him of himself at that age, before routine had worn away some of the wonder. Commander Amy said, her voice carrying a note of confusion, "I'm picking up something strange." Jake walked over to her station. "Strange how?" "It's a signal, sir. Very weak, coming from the edge of unexplored space. It's repeating in a loop." She adjusted her controls, trying to clean up the transmission. "It looks like a video broadcast." Jake frowned. There were no human colonies in that direction. No alien settlements either, as far as anyone knew. "Can you clear it up?" "Working on it, sir?" Amy's fingers moved across her console with practiced speed. The static on her screen began to resolve into something clearer. "Got it." Putting it on the main display, the bridge crew turned to watch as the image appeared on the large screen at the front of the room. At first, Jake did not understand what he was seeing. There were shapes moving, figures that might have been human, and other figures that definitely were not. Then the image sharpened further, and the sound came through. And Jake felt his blood turn to ice. The broadcast showed a human colony. He could tell from the architecture, the prefabricated buildings that every frontier settlement used. But the buildings were burning, and the streets were filled with bodies. Human bodies. Men and women and children, lying in pools of their own blood while alien creatures moved among them. The aliens were unlike anything Jake had ever seen. They were tall and heavily muscled, with skin the color of dried blood and faces that seemed to be all teeth and hunger. They carried weapons that looked more like butcher's tools than guns, and they were using those tools on the humans who were still alive. Jake watched as a woman was dragged screaming from a hiding place. He watched as children were rounded up like cattle. He watched as the aliens performed acts of cruelty that he had no words for. Acts that seemed designed not just to kill, but to cause maximum suffering. And through it all, the aliens were making sounds that his translator interpreted as laughter. "Oh God," someone whispered behind him. Jake did not know who. He could not look away from the screen. The broadcast continued for 12 minutes. 12 minutes of horror that burned itself into Jake's mind forever. When it finally ended, a new image appeared. One of the aliens, larger than the others, with ornate markings carved into its skin. It spoke, and the translator rendered its words in flat, emotionless English. Your kind is weak. Your kind is prey. Come and attempt to save them. We hunger for more. Then the screen went dark. For a long moment, no one on the bridge moved or spoke. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He could hear Amy crying quietly at her station. He could hear the soft hum of the ship's systems, indifferent to the horror they had just witnessed. "Sir," his first officer said finally, "what do we do?" Jake turned away from the screen. His hands were shaking. He had seen death before, had even killed in defense of his ship and crew. But this was different. This was not war. This was not conflict. This was slaughter for pleasure. Murder as entertainment. "Contact Terran Federation Command," he said, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, colder than he had ever heard it. "Send them everything. The broadcast, the coordinates, all of it. Priority 1, transmission." "Yes, sir." Jake looked at the faces of his crew. He saw fear there, and grief, and something else. Something harder. Something that had not been there before. He understood, because he felt it too. Within hours, the broadcast had spread to every human world. 14 billion people watched as their fellow humans were tortured and killed for sport. The aliens had identified themselves as the Varak hegemony. They had ruled their region of space for 2,000 years. They were predators. And they had just announced to the galaxy that they considered humanity nothing more than game animals. They expected fear. They expected panic. They expected humans to cower and hide and beg for mercy. They had made a terrible mistake. On Earth, in a small apartment in what used to be called Chicago, an old woman named Martha Hayes watched the broadcast. She was 93 years old, and she remembered stories her grandmother had told her about something called World War II, about what humans had done to each other in those dark years, about the capacity for violence that lived inside every human heart. She watched the Varak laughing as they killed, and she felt something stir inside her, something ancient, something that humanity had tried very hard to forget. The Varak had wanted to awaken fear in humanity. Instead, they had awakened something far worse. They had awakened rage. Admiral Patricia Cole had served in the Terran Federation Navy for 35 years. She had gray hair cut short in military fashion, a face lined by decades of responsibility, and eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine. She sat at the head of a long table in the Federation Council chamber on Earth, listening to politicians argue about what to do next. "We need to consider a diplomatic approach," one of them was saying. "A young man with soft hands and softer convictions. Perhaps we can negotiate with these Varak. Find out what they want." "They told us what they want," Patricia said quietly. "They want to hunt us. They want to kill us for sport. They made that very clear. But surely there must be some way to reach a peaceful solution. War would be costly. War would mean casualties on both sides." Patricia looked around the table at the assembled leaders of humanity. Some of them nodded along with the young politician. They were reasonable people, civilized people. They had grown up in an era of peace and prosperity. They had forgotten certain things about their own species. She stood up slowly, and the room fell silent. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured, but there was something underneath it that made everyone pay attention. "Let me tell you something about humanity," she said, "something we have spent 200 years trying to forget. We did not become a spacefaring civilization because we were peaceful. We did not survive on our homeworld because we were gentle." She walked to the window and looked out at the city below. Towers of glass and steel reaching toward the sky, parks filled with trees and flowers, children playing in the streets without fear. "Earth is what scientists call a death world," she continued. 70% of its surface is covered in salt water that we cannot drink. The weather patterns include hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and droughts. The planet is home to millions of species of predators, parasites, and venomous creatures. The very air we breathe was toxic until the first plants learned to process it. She turned back to face the council. "Our ancestors survived ice ages that lasted thousands of years. They survived plagues that killed half the population. They survived wars against each other that claimed hundreds of millions of lives. And do you know how they survived all of that? No one answered. They fought back. They always fought back. When predators hunted them, they learned to hunt the predators instead. When disease struck, they invented medicine. When nature tried to kill them, they bent nature to their will. That is what humans are. That is what humans have always been. She walked back to the table and placed both hands flat on its surface, leaning forward to look each council member in the eye. For 2 centuries, we have played the role of gentle explorers. We smiled at the other species. We traded with them. We made friends. And that was good. That was right. But it was a choice, not our nature. And the Varrock have given us reason to make a different choice now. The young politician opened his mouth to object, but Patricia cut him off. They are broadcasting the torture of our people across the galaxy. They are laughing while they do it. They have invited us to come and try to stop them. Her voice hardened. I intend to accept that invitation. 3,000 light-years away, on the colony world of New Pittsburgh, a man named Danny Morrison sat in his living room with his daughter Katie. She was 8 years old. With brown hair and her mother's eyes, her mother had died 3 years ago, a shuttle accident on the way to a medical conference. Since then, it had been just Danny and Katie against the world. Danny had served in the Navy for 15 years before retiring to raise his daughter. He had seen combat exactly twice, both times minor skirmishes with pirates. He had thought his fighting days were over. Then he watched the broadcast. Katie had been in the other room when it started. Thank God. He had turned it off before she could see. But he had seen enough. He had seen what those creatures did to children her age. That night, after Katie was asleep, Danny went to the closet where he kept his old uniform. He took it out and held it for a long time, feeling the weight of the fabric in his hands. He thought about his daughter growing up in a galaxy where things like the Varrock existed. He thought about what would happen if they came here, to New Pittsburgh, to this house. The next morning, took Katie to his sister's house and explained that he had to go away for a while. Katie cried and asked him not to leave. He knelt down and hugged her tight and promised that he would come back. Then he drove to the nearest recruitment center and signed up for active duty. He was not alone. The line at the recruitment center stretched around the block. Men and women of all ages, some who had never served and some who had retired decades ago. They were teachers and farmers and engineers and artists. They had one thing in common. They had all seen the broadcast. They had all felt the same thing Danny felt. The change happened faster than anyone expected. Within a week, every military factory on every human world was running at full capacity. Within a month, research programs that had been focused on medicine and agriculture were redirected to weapons development. Within 3 months, the Terran Federation Navy had doubled in size and showed no signs of slowing down. The alien ambassadors watched all of this with growing alarm. Counselor Torith of the Veth Collective had spent 40 years studying humans. He thought he understood them. He had written papers about their psychology, their culture, their quirks, and contradictions. He had described them as a young species with great potential, curious and friendly, and perhaps a bit naive. Now he watched as that species transformed before his eyes. The humans he met no longer smiled at him. They were polite, yes, but there was something behind their politeness now. Something cold and focused and utterly without mercy. He sent a private message to his government. Encrypted with the highest security protocols available, we made an error in our assessment of humanity, he wrote. We believed their peaceful nature was a sign of weakness. We were wrong. They were peaceful because they chose to be, because they had no reason to be otherwise. The Varrock have given them a reason, and now I fear we are about to see what humanity is truly capable of. He paused, considering his next words carefully. I recommend that all Veth citizens maintain absolute neutrality in the coming conflict. Do nothing that could be perceived as hostile toward humans. Do nothing that could be perceived as sympathetic toward the Varg, and pray to whatever gods. You believe in that we are never the ones who awaken this rage in them again. On Earth, Admiral Patricia Cole stood before a holographic map of known space. The Varrock hegemony sprawled across 43 star systems, a red stain on the display. Humanity's territory was marked in blue, much smaller, but growing every day. She studied the map for a long time. Then she began to plan. The Terran Federation officially declared war on the Varrock hegemony on a Tuesday morning. But Patricia knew that what they were planning was not really a war. It was an extinction. 6 months had passed since the broadcast, and the Varrock hegemony was waiting. They had prepared their defenses with the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. 43 star systems under their control, each one protected by orbital fortresses and defensive fleets. 2,000 years of conquest had made them strong. 12 other species had fallen before their advance, hunted to extinction or enslaved for labor and sport. Humanity would be no different, at least. That is what they believed. Supreme Huntmaster Krath stood on the observation deck of his flagship, watching his armada conduct war games in the void. He was old by Varrock standards, nearly 200 years, and he had personally led the conquest of 6 species. He remembered the taste of each one, the way they screamed, the way they begged, the way the light faded from their eyes when they finally understood that no help was coming. He expected the same from humans. His intelligence reports told him that humanity was a young species, spread thin across their colonies. With a small military focused on defense and exploration rather than conquest, they would come, driven by rage and grief, and they would break themselves against his defenses, like waves against a cliff. Then he would hunt the survivors at his leisure. He was wrong about everything. In a secure laboratory on Earth's moon, a woman named Linda Park stared at equations floating in the air before her. She was 51 years old, with streaks of white in her black hair, and the kind of mind that saw patterns where others saw only chaos. Before the broadcast, she had been working on quantum physics applications for faster-than-light communication. Important work, but peaceful work. Now she was building weapons. The principle was elegant in its simplicity. Matter was held together by fundamental forces operating at the quantum level. If you could destabilize those forces, matter would simply fall apart. No explosion, no radiation, just dissolution at the molecular level. A ship hit by such a weapon would not burn or break. It would simply cease to exist. A military liaison named Colonel Sam Bennett visited her laboratory every week to check on progress. He was a hard man with kind eyes, and he always brought her coffee from the good cafe on the base. How powerful can we make it? He asked during one visit, watching a test target dissolve into nothing on the display screen. Linda considered the question. She thought about the broadcast. About the children being rounded up like animals. About the sound of Varrock laughter. How powerful do you want it? She asked. Sam looked at her for a long moment. We need to be able to destroy their fleet, their orbital defenses, their military infrastructure. That's not what I asked. He was silent for a while. Then he said, very quietly, we need to be able to destroy everything. Linda nodded slowly. I can do that. Far from Earth, Commander Jake Lawson led a small team through the darkness between stars. He had been reassigned 6 months ago to a special operations unit called the Reapers. Their job was to infiltrate Varrock space and gather intelligence on enemy positions, defenses, and capabilities. What they found was worse than anyone had imagined. They landed on a frontier world that should have been uninhabited, a barren rock with no strategic value. But their sensors had picked up anomalous readings, and Jake had learned to trust anomalous readings. They found the mass graves on the 3rd day. Thousands of human remains. Men, women, children. Some of them had been dead for decades. The Varrock had been hunting humans in secret long before the broadcast. Evergreen was not their first atrocity. It was simply the first one they had chosen to advertise. Jake stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at the bones of his people. Beside him, Sergeant Maria Santos, his second-in-command, wiped tears from her eyes with angry swipes of her hand. How long? She asked. How long have they been doing this? Jake checked the dating on the oldest remains. At least 40 years. Maybe longer. 40 years. They've been killing us for 40 years, and we never knew. We know now. They documented everything. Recorded every grave, every piece of evidence, every scrap of data they could find. Then they transmitted it all back to Earth and waited for the response. The response was silence. A long, terrible silence that seemed to stretch across the light years. And then finally, a single message from Admiral Patricia Cole. Proceed with reconnaissance. Report all findings. We are coming. When the evidence reached Earth, it spread through the population like wildfire. The last voices calling for restraint, for negotiation, for mercy, fell silent. There was nothing left to say. The Varak had made their intentions clear decades ago. They had simply been too arrogant to hide them properly. Admiral Patricia Cole unveiled her battle plan 3 weeks later. She called it Operation Reckoning, though some of her officers had other names for it. The cleansing. The purge. The ending. It was the largest military operation in human history, and its objective was simple: the complete and total destruction of the Varak hegemony as a military power. Every shipyard across 17 star systems worked around the clock. Every colony contributed resources, personnel, and supplies. Civilians volunteered for dangerous jobs in weapons factories. Scientists abandoned decades of research to focus on military applications. Artists created propaganda posters that hung in every public space. Musicians wrote songs about vengeance and justice and the fire that burned in every human heart. The Sundari ambassador. High Speaker Velos requested a meeting with a human diplomat named Chris Bradley. Velos was old and wise by Sundari standards, and he had seen many things in his long life. But he had never seen anything like this. "How far do you intend to go?" he asked Chris, watching the human's face carefully. "What is your end goal?" Chris was young, barely 30, but his eyes looked much older now. Everyone's eyes looked older since the broadcast. "We intend to end them," he said simply. "End them? You mean defeat them militarily?" "No, I mean end them. As a threat? As a power? As a presence in this galaxy?" Chris paused. They wanted to hunt us. They wanted to make us afraid. Instead, they reminded us what we are. And what are you? Chris smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We are the descendants of people who hunted mammoths with spears, who fought lions with nothing but rocks and determination, who survived ice ages and plagues and wars that killed millions. We are predators, High Speaker. We just forgot it for a while." Velos felt a chill run through his scaled body. The Varak have 43 systems. Thousands of ships, millions of soldiers, I know. And you still believe you can destroy them completely. Chris leaned forward. "Let me tell you something about humans, High Speaker. When we decide something needs to be done, we do it. We put men on our moon with technology less advanced than your children's toys. We cured diseases that killed billions. We built ships that could cross between stars. And now we have decided that the Varak need to be removed from this galaxy." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. They should have left us alone. They should have stayed in their corner of space and been content with the species they had already conquered. But they got greedy. They got arrogant. They broadcast their cruelty across the stars and invited us to come and stop them. He turned back to face Velos. "We're coming. And when we're done, the only thing left of the Varak hegemony will be a warning in the history books about what happens when you make humanity your enemy." The human fleet emerged from hyperspace, like a storm breaking over a peaceful sea. 3,200 warships, ranging from massive dreadnoughts to swift destroyers, appeared in the void above Krath Prime. The first major Varak military stronghold on the border of their territory, the orbital defense stations detected them immediately and began transmitting warnings to the surface. Supreme Huntmaster Krath received the report with something between amusement and anticipation. Finally, the prey had arrived. He had expected them to come eventually, driven by their primitive emotions, their pathetic need for revenge. He had prepared extensively for this moment. His fleet outnumbered theirs. His defenses were formidable. He would crush them here, and then follow the survivors back to their homeworld. He was still smiling when the first wave of human weapons struck his orbital stations. The stations did not explode. They did not burn or break apart. They simply dissolved, matter coming undone at the fundamental level, leaving nothing behind but empty space, where moments before there had been tons of metal and thousands of soldiers. The quantum destabilization weapons had arrived. Admiral Patricia Cole stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Vengeance, watching the battle unfold on her tactical display. She had not slept more than 3 hours in any given night for the past 6 months. Dark circles shadowed her eyes and her uniform hung slightly loose on her frame. But her voice was steady when she gave orders, and her mind was as sharp as it had ever been. "Target their command ships first," she said. "Then their heavy cruisers. I want their fleet command and control eliminated within the first hour." Lieutenant Kevin Shaw, her aide, relayed the orders to the fleet. He was young, barely 23, and he had joined the Navy 2 weeks after the broadcast. His older brother had been on Evergreen. They had never found his body. The battle lasted for hours. The Varak fought with the ferocity of cornered predators, but ferocity was not enough against weapons that could unmake matter itself, against a fleet that fought with cold precision rather than hot rage. One by one, the Varak ships fell. The great orbital stations crumbled into nothing. The defensive satellites went dark. When it was over, Krath Prime lay exposed and defenseless beneath the human fleet. "Commander." Jake Lawson led the ground forces down through the atmosphere. His dropships screamed through clouds of smoke and debris, flanked by hundreds of others, all carrying soldiers ready to fight and die for their species. They landed near the primary Varak data center, a massive underground complex that housed records of every military operation the hegemony had ever conducted. The fighting on the ground was brutal. The Varak were physically stronger than humans, with teeth and claws that could tear through armor. But the humans had numbers, training, and something the Varak had not expected: absolute fearlessness. Soldiers advanced into certain death with steady hands and clear eyes. They took wounds that should have been fatal and kept fighting until their bodies gave out. Sergeant Maria Santos took a Varak blade through her shoulder during the assault on the data center entrance. She broke off the blade, used it to kill the alien who had wounded her, and then continued leading her squad into the complex. She would receive a medal for that action later, though she never wore it. Inside the data center, Jake found what he had come for: records of every atrocity the Varak had committed, stretching back centuries, not just against humans, but against a dozen other species. Some of those species had names he recognized from historical records. Others had been so thoroughly exterminated that no trace remained except in Varak trophy rooms. He downloaded everything. Every file, every image, every piece of evidence of what the hegemony truly was. Then he transmitted it to the fleet to be broadcast across the galaxy. The campaign continued with methodical precision. After Krath Prime, the human fleet moved to the next system, and the next, and the next. Each battle followed the same pattern. The Varak would prepare their defenses, confident in their strength. The humans would arrive and destroy everything in their path. No negotiation. No mercy. No survivors among military targets. Civilian populations were spared. Admiral Cole was very clear about that. They were not monsters. They were not going to become the thing they were fighting against. But every soldier, every ship, every weapons factory, every military installation fell before the advance. Supreme Huntmaster Krath fell at the Battle of Vorax. The Vorak's oldest military academy. He died on the bridge of his flagship, still giving orders, still refusing to believe that his species could be defeated by what he considered inferior prey. His last words, according to survivors who witnessed his death, were a curse against humanity and a vow that the hunt would continue from beyond death. The humans gave his body to his people for proper disposal. Even enemies deserved some dignity in death, they said, though many of them felt the gesture was more than the Varak deserved. On Earth, the public watched the campaign unfold through carefully edited news broadcasts. They saw the victories, the liberated human prisoners found in Varak holding facilities, the systematic destruction of the enemy's military capacity. They did not see everything. They did not need to see everything. Danny Morrison fought in 7 battles before the assault on the Varak homeworld. He had changed since leaving New Pittsburgh, grown harder and quieter. He rarely spoke about what he had seen, what he had done. But he kept a picture of Katie in his helmet, and he looked at it before every engagement. He wrote her letters when he could, telling her about the planets he visited and the stars he saw. He never mentioned the fighting. He never mentioned the friends he lost. He just told her that he loved her and that he was doing important work to keep her safe. The Varrock. High Command made 3 attempts at negotiation during the campaign. The first time, they offered to release all human prisoners and pay financial reparations. The response from Earth was a single word: no. The second time, they offered to cede all territory bordering human space and sign a permanent non-aggression treaty. The response was the same: no. The third time, they simply begged for mercy. The response was silence. Followed by the arrival of the human fleet, Counselor Torith of the Veth watched from the safety of neutral space, documenting everything he could. He sent regular reports to his government, each one more disturbing than the last. They do not negotiate, he wrote. They do not accept surrender. They do not respond to pleas for mercy. They simply keep coming, like a force of nature, like a tide that cannot be stopped. I have studied hundreds of species in my long career. I have never seen anything like this. The humans have become something terrible, something that will change the balance of power in this galaxy forever. He paused, considering his next words carefully, and yet I cannot find it in myself to condemn them. The Varrock earned this fate. They invited it with their cruelty, their arrogance, their contempt for all other life. They believed themselves to be the ultimate predators. They discovered too late that humanity was simply sleeping. The final assault on the Varrock homeworld began on a Tuesday. Earth time. 3,000 ships descended on a planet that had ruled an empire for 2,000 years. The battle lasted 12 days. When it was over, the Varrock hegemony existed only in history books. Danny Morrison died on the 9th day, leading a charge against the last Varrock defensive position. He saved 16 members of his squad by drawing enemy fire to himself. He was still holding the picture of Katie when they found his body. The war ended not with a treaty, not with a ceremony, not with handshakes and signatures on documents. It ended with silence. The silence of a species that had once terrorized the galaxy. Now scattered and broken and reduced to refugees, begging for scraps from those they had once considered prey, the Varrock military was gone. Their leadership had been tried for crimes against sentient life by a galactic tribunal, found guilty on every count, and executed. Their empire had been dismantled, their weapons destroyed, their warships melted down into raw materials. What remained of their population lived in camps under human supervision, watched by soldiers who made no effort to hide their contempt, but who followed their orders to treat the civilians with basic dignity. It was over. Humanity had won. Commander Jake Lawson returned to Earth 3 months after the final battle. He was 43 years old now, though he felt much older. His hair had gone completely gray during the campaign, and there were scars on his body that would never fully heal. He walked with a slight limp from an injury he had taken during the ground assault on Krath Prime. He did not feel like a hero. He felt tired, tired in ways that sleep could not fix. His first stop on Earth was the memorial. It had been built in the capital, a vast wall of black stone stretching for half a mile. Covered with the names of every human killed by the Varrock, the names from Evergreen were there, along with the names from the secret mass graves they had found, along with the names of soldiers who had died in the war. Too many names. Far too many names. Jake walked along the wall until he found the section for the fallen soldiers. He reached out and touched one name in particular: Daniel Morrison, Sergeant First Class. He had not known Danny well. They had met twice, during briefings before major operations. But he remembered the picture in Danny's helmet, the little girl with brown hair and her mother's eyes. He had made sure someone sent that picture to Danny's family after he died. A young woman approached the wall while Jake stood there. She was 18 or 19, with brown hair and eyes that looked familiar. She carried flowers in her hands, and she walked with the careful dignity of someone trying very hard not to cry. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Commander Lawson?" Jake nodded. My name is Katie Morrison. My father served under you. He wrote about you in his letters. Jake felt something tighten in his chest. Your father was a brave man. One of the bravest I ever knew. He was my dad, Katie said simply. She placed the flowers at the base of the wall, beneath her father's name. He promised he would come back. He always kept his promises before. There was nothing Jake could say to that. Some promises could not be kept, no matter how much someone wanted to keep them. He died protecting his squad, Jake said finally. He saved 16 people that day. They made it home because of him. Katie nodded slowly. That sounds like him. He always said, "You take care of your people first." They stood together in silence for a while, looking at the wall of names. Then Katie wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. I enlisted last month, she said. I ship out for basic training next week. Jake looked at her, this young woman who had lost so much, who had every reason to turn away from military service forever. Why? Because someone has to make sure this never happens again. Someone has to stand watch. She touched her father's name gently. He taught me that. Across the galaxy, Admiral Patricia Cole stood. On a stage before the assembled officers of the Terran Federation Navy, she was retiring from active service after 36 years. Her final address had been written and rewritten a dozen times, and she had ultimately thrown out all the drafts and decided to speak from the heart. We did not want this war, she said, her voice carrying through the vast auditorium. We did not seek it. We were content to explore, to trade, to build relationships with our neighbors in this vast universe. But when the war came, when it was thrust upon us by an enemy that saw us as nothing more than animals to be hunted, we answered. She paused, looking out at the faces of the men and women who had served under her command. Let the galaxy remember what they saw in these past months. Let them remember that humanity extends its hand in friendship first. Always first. We prefer peace. We choose peace whenever it is possible. But when that hand is bitten, when our people are slaughtered for sport, when our children are taken and tortured for entertainment, her voice hardened. We do not forgive. We do not forget. And we do not stop until the job is done. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Patricia barely heard it. She was thinking about all the young men and women who would never come home, all the families that had been destroyed, all the innocents that had been lost. The victory was real, but so was the cost, far from Earth. On a neutral space station, Counselor Toreth of the Veth sat across from a young student who had traveled far to ask him questions. The student was researching galactic history and wanted to understand what had happened during the Human-Varak War. Tell me about the humans, the student said. What are they really like? Toreth considered the question for a long time. He had spent decades studying humanity, had watched them transform from peaceful explorers into the most terrifying military force the galaxy had ever seen, and had watched them transform back again into builders and dreamers. They are strange creatures, he said finally. They build hospitals and schools. They write poetry and music. They weep at beauty and rage at injustice. They adopt pets from other species and treat them like family. They spend resources on art and entertainment that could be used for more practical purposes. He paused. But buried deep inside them, deeper than most of them even know, is something ancient and terrible. Something born from millions of years of survival on a world that tried to kill them every day of their existence. Other species evolved to flee from predators. Humans evolved to hunt them instead. They climbed to the top of their food chain through sheer determination and refused to stop climbing. The student looked uncertain. So they are dangerous? Oh yes, very dangerous. Perhaps the most dangerous species this galaxy has ever produced. Toreth smiled slightly, but they prefer not to be. They genuinely want peace and friendship. They would rather build than destroy. The Varak forgot this. The Varak saw their peaceful nature as weakness and decided to test it. And they discovered the truth. They discovered that humanity's peace is a choice, not a limitation, and that when humans choose war instead, there's no force in the galaxy that can stand against them. On the frontier, new human colonies rose from the ashes of the old. The children growing up in these places learned history differently than their parents had. They learned about the time before the broadcast, when humanity was young and optimistic and believed the galaxy was a friendly place. They learned about the war, about the terrible things that were done, and the terrible things that were done in response. They learned about the price of peace and the cost of war, and they learned the most important lesson of all, that strength and kindness were not opposites. That you could extend your hand in friendship while keeping a sword at your side. That the best way to prevent war was to make potential enemies understand, truly understand. What would happen if they started one? Somewhere in the vastness of space, other predatory species heard whispers of what had happened to the Varic hegemony. They heard about the broadcast and the response. They heard about the weapons that could unmake matter. They heard about the fleet that had destroyed an empire in less than a year. They adjusted their expansion plans accordingly. Humanity, they decided, was best left alone. The broadcast had been meant to terrorize. It had been meant to establish the Varrock as the dominant predators of the galaxy, with humanity as their chosen prey. Instead, it had awakened something that had slept inside the human species for centuries. Something fierce and ancient and utterly without mercy when provoked. The galaxy would never forget. The galaxy would never make the same mistake. And humanity would continue to build and explore and dream, with one eye always watching the stars, ready to defend their children and their future against any threat that dared to emerge from the darkness. That was the legacy of the broadcast. That was the price the Varrock paid for their arrogance. And that was the promise humanity made to itself and to the universe. Never again. Never again would they be prey. Never again would they be victims. Never again would they allow such evil to go unanswered. The stars were vast and full of wonders, and humanity would face them all, together, with courage and hope and the knowledge of what they were capable of becoming if they ever needed to become it again.